Welcome tonight, and let's get our Bible study started in Habakkuk chapter 3. And this chapter has 19 verses in it. The first verse and the very end, the very last line of the last verse, basically are instructions, musical instructions, really. This is why this book sometimes gets called a prayer or a psalm, because there are some musical notations, and there are a couple of those throughout the chapter as well. But you can see there in chapter 3, verse 1, it says, "A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet according to Shigionoth," and that's one of those musical terms that we often find in the Psalms, and it's also one of those terms I don't think we know what means. We got a couple of ideas. It's like Selah. You remember seeing Selah or Salah, however it's pronounced, all through the book of Psalms. We have no idea what that musical notation means. You will hear some people argue it means it's like a rest, like you should pause. But to be perfectly honest, we don't really know at all. And then it says there at the end of chapter 3, "To the choir master with stringed instruments." So that tells us it was not just a cappella, but there was actually probably a harp or a lyre or a flute or maybe a drum or maybe all of those that were there. And this is what's really interesting is to me about all of the Psalms, especially the ones that have like we could tell they had some musical accompaniment. Well, obviously there's no record of the music. There's no musical notation. But they understood, the people who were musicians that performed these, they understood what it was supposed to sound like. They knew that if it was a praise psalm, then it had a certain pace and beat and meter and a certain style, or if it was supposed to be a prayer, or if it was a lament, or all those different kind of types. They could tell by looking at the psalm and studying it, and then they would know. Sometimes that's just looking at the content of it. They would know what kind of music to put with that. And that sounds bizarre to me, but I've seen a few musicians that play music by ear. And so they can just kind of hear a little bit about how it goes and jump in and play something, You know the old line about, "No, I don't know that song, but hum a few bars and I'll catch up with you." I think that's probably the kind of situation that we're dealing with. I think there may have been some more formal study and preparation and things like that you kind of learn to play, and then you just did that. I know from talking to Leandro over the years, playing without musical notes is kind of a horrifying thought. You don't do that. You've got to have music, and that's not really that's not a knock on her musicianship at all. But she plays a lot by ear, but it starts with the music, and then she kind of improvises from there. Other people just do something completely different. Y'all remember when Dorn was here and he played the piano a few times. He read music, but he kind of had his style and his own little, and none of that was written at all. That was just his approach to music to kind of come out. And so those terms, even though we don't know what they meant, we know they had some context in that meaning that was there. And then what's really interesting to us sometimes is when we read it, it doesn't sound lyrical to us for the most part at all. A lot of times, the old joke, it doesn't rhyme. I've heard Aaron Andrews say before, all good poems start out, roses are red, violets are blue. And there's some truth to that. But it doesn't really even sound like that. Well, the big reason for that is, one, they wrote poetry differently than we write poetry. And then the biggest issue of all is, it was written in Hebrew and not in English. And you just can't translate that stuff, no matter how hard you try. And so it's amazing that it looks as even and balanced as it does, if you ask me, when it comes to the translation elements. So we clearly see a prayer, and then in verse 2, the psalm or the prayer begins, and it begins basically with his petition. And Habakkuk cries to the Lord and says, "O Lord, I have heard the report of you, and your work, O Lord, I do fear. And your work, O Lord, do I fear. But in the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy." God came from Teman, and the Holy One from the Mount of Paran. His splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. His brightness was like the light. Rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. Before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. Was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? Was your anger against the rivers, or your indignation against the sea? When you rode on your horses, on your chariot of salvation, you stripped the sheath from your bow, calling for many arrows. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed. The raging waters swept on. The deep gave forth its voice. It lifted its hands on high. The sun and moon stood still in their place at the light of your arrows as they sped, and the flash of your glittering spear. You marched through the earth in fury. You threshed the nations in anger. You went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare from thigh to neck. You pierced him with your own arrows, the heads of his warriors. You came like a whirlwind to scatter me, rejoicing as if to devour the poor in secret. You trampled the sea with your horses, the surging of mighty waters. This is the word of the Lord. So it begins there in verse 2 with that petition. And Habakkuk, he admits, Lord, I know I have hurt you. And I know that you have been revealed down through the ages. And I want you to remember not just your wrath that you promised us, but Lord, I want you to remember your mercy as well. Now, as we look at verses 3 through 15, this is basically, if we think very big kind of theme-wise, this is basically Habakkuk talking about God and talking about him as a powerful presence throughout history. If you read down there, starting in verse 3 and kind of following, you pick up some thematic elements, which has led a couple commentators to say he's kind of rehearsing the Exodus story. He brings up some specific places here. He talks about pestilence and plague. He talks about measuring the earth and shaking the mountain. And that's kind of a Sinai type comment. All of those elements, and most of those I think are through 3 through 7. and others have said he's not really specifically talking about the exile or the history of Israel. He's just talking about Israelite type themes and the way God has kind of delivered them down through the ages and reminding of that. And so all of these in 3 through 7, instead of, Bob Utley talks about it in the context of it being kind of a retelling of the Exodus. But Baker, I think that's his last name, that I've been using from the Tyndale New Testament series, it says that really the bigger theme, the main point is that God comes to those who are in need. And so while there may be some parallels with the Exodus, it's really a much broader, more general description of God coming to the relief of those who are in danger. And in verses 8 through 15, kind of what makes me think that maybe Baker might be right about that. I think that's his name. is when you look at verses 8 through 15, now he seems to be borrowing from stories about Canaanite gods. And in many of the Canaanite gods, which we find commonly in polytheism, is different elements of nature are personified and then worshipped. Like thunder and lightning are personified as Baal, and his arrows are the lightning bolts that he throws. And so they're worshiping nature, but they're worshiping Baal as the god of these elements. And then we might talk about harvest, or the rivers, or the seas, or the mountains. And so they're worshiping nature, but they've worshipped to the extent that nature's been personified as a deity, and they're worshiping the deity. And what we see in 8 through 15 is Habakkuk describing God as the one who is responsible for all these things. It's not Baal, it's not nature, it's the Lord that carries this power and has these things. And so, I thought that's the first time I had ever read that anywhere, and I thought that was a really interesting kind of way of kind of debunking it. We talked last week about when we talked about chapter 2 and the second question and response, and I pointed to some parallels between the passage and Acts chapter 17, where Paul talked about the sermon at the Areopagus. When Baker was describing this 8 through 15, that's very similar to that same idea of Acts 17, where he says, you guys have worshipped what you don't know, what you don't understand. You've worshipped all these deities, but I'm here to proclaim to you the one true God who did all these things that are there. So even these verses make me think, I know Paul was a rabbi. I know he knew Habakkuk. I know he knew Habakkuk probably knew it well. But this is him kind of thinking and theologizing or philosophizing from the book to make that New Testament kind of application. So in other words, what Habakkuk is doing is he's taking the creator myths of the Canaanites and unwinding them and putting the focus back on the actual creator, who is Yahweh. And so he's saying that God is the creator. God is our deliverer, is another theme. We can kind of see that in the 3 through 7, but we see it all the way through this. And let me pause there and see if there are any comments or questions.
So he's trying to say that the Canaanites' polytheism was not legitimate.
Right. And that all of the things that they worshiped the false deities for were things that God actually did for them. And here he's talking to Judeans, but the Judeans are getting caught up in the Canaanite religions. And so he's trying to they've been brainwashed maybe, and he's trying to deprogram them. That might not be that's anachronistic, but I think that kind of is my idea. It's the same thing that we ought to do when we hear people around us today give credit to something for something that we know good and well that God did. If they praise, I don't care what it is, government, good fortune, luck, somebody else's kindness, we need to run that through Habakkuk and debunk that and say, you know what? I'm glad that the Lord used that person to bring us that good gift, but we shouldn't praise that person. Maybe we should honor them for being a good servant, a good steward, but they and we ought to what? Praise the Lord. And so we need to, and it's the same thing we ought to do when we see people maybe blaming God for things that maybe they were responsible for, or maybe no one was responsible for. And we need to kind of find a way to debunk that as well. Other questions or comments? So he moves forward, beginning in verse 8, from talking about God as a creator and as a deliverer, to talking about God as a divine warrior, a protector of his peoples. And here we have, picking up in verse 8 and going all the way through 15, and notice the shift that's here too. Well, let's start with this. He starts describing God as having a bow. He talks about attacking and raging against the mountains and the water, the sun and moon. Your arrows sped towards them, verse 11. Verse 12, you marched through the earth in fury. You threshed the nations in anger. All of these things are picturing God as a divine warrior. Back to that kind of secondary point I was jumping too quickly. Notice in verses 3 through 7, Habakkuk talks about God in the third person. He did this. We saw him. Look at what happens starting in verse 8. He starts talking to God in the second person. You, Lord. So in other words, in 3 through 7, we see him praising the Lord, talking about the Lord as deliverer and creator, but now he moves in addressing the Lord. And that continues really through the end of the book. There's a little bit of third person there at the very end, but the rest of that is all him describing God. In other words, okay, because remember our bigger story of Habakkuk. Habakkuk is challenging the Lord. Lord, look at the Judeans. We're back in chapter 1. Lord, look at the Judeans. They're wicked and evil, and we have a covenant with you, and you promised us you would punish the unrighteous, and yet there they are, the leaders of Judea, and they're unrighteous, and you're not doing a single thing about it. And God says, we're still in chapter 1, well, I am doing something about it. I'm preparing the Babylonians, and they're going to come and punish the evil, wicked, unrighteous Judeans. And Habakkuk says, Lord, how can you use the Babylonians are worse than, how is that righteousness? They're more unrighteous than the unrighteous. That doesn't get us anywhere, Lord. The Babylonians will just gobble everything up. And then the Lord responds. Now Habakkuk is realizing, I fear the Lord. I know what the Lord is like. I think it was Utley who compared this to the end of the book of Job, where Job finally takes his complaint to the Lord, and the Lord says, hey, Job, where were you when I was laying the roots down on these mountains? When I was filling all these divots with waters, making the oceans and the sea, where were you at? And so God is putting him in his place. Habakkuk's kind of doing this to himself. Lord, I know you are a mighty and awesome warrior, and the whole earth should fear who you are and what you're about. And so that's kind of the role of the divine warrior. And then it comes to these final few verses where he is maybe Habakkuk's, shall we say, indignation hits against the true power and presence of the Lord, both historically and in the presence. And now what happens is Habakkuk remembers his place. He comes back to that point of humility. Look at verse 16. Let's read 16 through the end of the book and kind of see that. I hear and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble before me. My legs tremble beneath me. Yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon the people who invade us. He says, okay, Lord, I know how awesome and how powerful you are, and I know this day of judgment is coming through the Babylonians. I'll be quiet and I'll wait now. I will wait for those to come upon us. Remember earlier in the book, Habakkuk just said, with his second question, I'm going to go up here on this watchtower now, Lord, and I want to hear your answer. I'll be on the lookout for it. And now he says, I've realized what I've said, and my whole being is coming undone. Then keep going, verse 17. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there shall be no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. So now he moves to one of the most powerful statements about trusting and having faith in the Lord in spite of the fact that everything around us seems to be failing. That verse 17, he's listing off all of their major crops. He's listing off all of the things that bring sustenance to the people. Fig tree, fruit of the vines, that's the grapes. The olives, the fields yield no food. The flock be cut off from the fold. No herd in the stalls. If you go back to Deuteronomy and look in Deuteronomy chapter 8 and chapter 10, where Israel is described as a good land, at the core of all of the great things that Israel is going to produce, they're listed right there in verse 17. There are other things. He talks about the iron in the hills and the copper and all that stuff. But and we know the Mediterranean diet. We know the Mediterranean diet was primarily grapes, wheat, and olive. That has been the Mediterranean diet since there was a Mediterranean. And he's saying, so those core things, they're gone. Just like we think about in our culture, a lot of times we think about, meat and potatoes. We think kind of old school, meat and potatoes, or whatever. We want to go fast food, hamburgers and hot dogs, or whatever you want to go. Those are these things. And they can't imagine, they cannot imagine life without those things. I remember one of the first times I brought Daniel Wong to stay at my house for several days. I think he came on spring break with me my freshman year. Daniel was born in Shanghai, China, and grew up in Hong Kong, and came to the States for his education. And we were asking Daniel, when he come to the house, my mom's a mom, and so she was saying, what can I cook for you? What do you want me to cook for you that you really miss? And Daniel said, what I would really like is a really good bowl of rice. And my mom said, we can do that. And he goes, would you let me cook it? She said, yes. And so we learned how to make rice the right way from Daniel. For Daniel, you could have a huge feast, but if you didn't have rice, you hadn't eaten. And so it's kind of like I can remember my grandfather always having to have bread and stuff. No matter whatever else you had to have bread and butter on the table, or it wasn't a meal. Anybody remember that concept, that idea? And what Habakkuk is saying, even though all those things fail me, all those things that we need to live, even though all of those things fail, and I'm separated from those things that are comfort foods, that bring us sustenance and joy, even if all those fail, verse 18, I will rejoice in the Lord, and I will take joy in the God of my salvation. Wow, that's a pretty powerful statement. This is another one of those major themes, is trusting God's word even when things aren't going well, and living faithfully despite having trouble, not being fair weather Christians. When God's blessing us, things seem to go well. Actually, I find most people, just generically, myself included, we're more like foul weather Christians. When things aren't good, we tend to call on the Lord and pray more. And then when they go good, we forget all about it. We're kind of backwards on it, aren't we? But here he's telling us that even when things are difficult, we still trust in the Lord. And this is another refrain of what we read back in chapter 2, verse 4, the just shall live by faith, or the righteous shall live by faith. You with me? And so here he's telling us, when everything fails, the righteous trust in the Lord. When the Babylonians are coming, the righteous trust in the Lord. It's a good lesson there, isn't it? Uncertainties, difficulties. We haven't had to deal with any uncertainties or difficulties in the last 3 or 4 months, have we? As a culture, not a bit. Not a lick. Right? And, or even just anxiety or the politics of it all. We haven't had any problems. And this is one of those times, like all times, but this is one of those times when we need to continue to be faithful and trust in the Lord. I'm not saying the Lord brought COVID to test us. I think that's goofy. It's a virus. It happens. That's reality. It's part of where we live, and we live in a fallen world, and that's the way it goes. But I am saying this is one of those times when we can trust the Lord. Verse 19. The Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. He's talking about, when we think about deer, we kind of think of a different way. We need to think like mountain goats, or those deer that leap from rocks to rocks to rocks. I saw one of those goats climbing up the side of a cement dam. Now, how in the world? But yet they can do it. And notice he says, makes me tread on my high places. I think here the high places, those difficulties, those struggles, those kind of obstacles that we have to overcome and go forward from there. Questions or comments?
I had a question about the chariots of salvation.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Help me with the verse there.
It is 8 and 9.
I think it might just mean, right there at the end of verse 8. I think that might just be a euphemism for deliverance. That's the chariot of salvation. That's how we were delivered. And what beyond that, I can't say much. I can tell you that the chariot was the number one war machine of their day and time, and that as the different cultures gained the ability to make chariots, especially when they were able to make them from iron, which we're on the tail end of the Iron Age here, probably an Iron 2 or Iron 3 in Israel at this time. So late in the process, as those cultures gained that technology, they became more fearsome. That's what was going on with Egypt and Babylon. Or the easier way to say it is really the Mesopotamian cultures, because first it's Assyria, then it's Babylon, then it's the Medes and the Persians, then it's the Greeks. But it's that same culture, that's that same area that fights with Egypt. And Israel's in between. Both of those cultures got iron technology before Israel ever did. In fact, that's probably what made the United Monarchy, Saul, David, and Solomon, such a great kingdom, because Saul and David correspond with the birth of iron in Israel. when they're able to get that technology. There's several passages. I have to go. You could probably Google them or something like that and find them. There's a couple of passages probably in 1 Samuel, where it talks about the Israelites going to the Philistines to have their swords sharpened, and because the Philistines got the technology before the Israelites did, and they were hungry for getting that to defend themselves against the Philistines and the others as well. But the chariot, once the iron chariots came in, that was the tank, the B-1 bomber. That was the chief technology that put them either on level playing field with everybody else or put them above those who didn't have it. And I think there's a famous story. I'm trying to remember where this is. Maybe you can help me remember it. But this is where when they fight, they often fight in the valley of Megiddo, in the Kishon Valley, there in that northern part of Samaria, right just south of Galilee, if we think about New Testament maps. And there's a river there, and they had a huge rain. They were having the battlefield, and the one army had chariots and the other army didn't. But a huge rain came, which mitigated the use of the chariots, and then the Israelites were able to rout them or win the war. And that's one of the passages where it talks about the mighty Kishon. Well, the Kishon is the name of the river, but it's a dirty little creek for the most part, unless it rains, and then it's the major drainage through that whole area. Does anybody remember that specific story? It might be a Judges story. It might be in Judges. I can't remember, but that's a Judges, 1 Samuel story right in there. Other than that, I can't help you much. But I think that's probably it. Was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? Was your anger against the rivers, or your indignation against the sea, when you rode on your horses, on your chariot of salvation? It's poetry, so it's all alliterative language, or figurative language, I should say. Yeah. Other questions? When I was reading through the commentaries, I don't remember picking up on that chariot of salvation was any type of a specific reference or comment. All right, let's have a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, Lord. We ask you to help us to remember to be righteous and to have faith at all times. When the crops fail, when the crops bring in a bumper crop, Lord, let us be faithful and trust in you, because we know it's your hand and your hand alone that can strengthen us and can deliver us. And it's always you sustaining us. In success and failure, you sustain us. In your name we pray.